kind of started talking about as you started, coming into 2014, having working out more kind of workout regimen and stuff. And obviously in a stock car, like, yeah, you got hot days and yeah, you can get wore out in a race at a, more physical rough track. But, what is the physicality like of, you're just talking about the speed of hanging on to a Champ 440, but now you're hanging off to the left, dragging your knee on the ice. Yeah. I mean, and going over, bumps and ruts and, racing at 100 and some miles an hour. What is that physicality portion of that like?
Yeah, it's hard to put into words because there's a lot of body parts that you're using, like you talked about. You're hanging over the edge, you're holding on tight. You gotta wipe your visor going down the straightaway. So there's a lot of elements that are physically draining, and the fact that it's such a quick race. Say 25 lapper at Eagle River. Doesn't seem like that much, but when you're hanging on for dear life and you have a death grip of 100%. It's hard to hold, something at 100% for a long period of time. And that's where, the training and where I think everybody as a whole, all the racers knew how important that, the sleds kept getting closer and closer package wise, that then the only advantage is, are you a little bit stronger to go faster the last 3 laps of the race? Or, can you maybe lean just a little bit harder in the corner than the other guy because you're not tired? So then that's kind of where, that next level, kind of kept raising. And I know we always had that, prior to, say, my days of the Pro Champ racing, because way back when, those guys were still, they were old school and they were still, putting in the work and doing everything needed and testing. It just at that point, like I said, I think the competition just kept narrowing in closer and closer that, there easily was 10 guys that could win every single weekend. So, yeah, you would work on the, the forearm strength, just the overall core and cardio, because if your breathing got way off, then you're not focused at, okay, was I faster that lap or was I maybe slower, and you need to try and have that mental clarity to make good decisions and enter the corner where you think you're faster or not make those mistakes. And that's kind of where it came down to. And for me personally, like I said, about that 2014 is when I kind of got more into a rhythm and understanding what was needed to run at a higher level at that point.
And I mean, would you have instances where you're running someone down and you're catching them and, maybe you're faster in general, but you can just see that rider's being a little bit lazy and you can tell they're not quite hanging off the way they should because they're tired? I mean, could you tell that in other riders at times?
Yeah, you definitely could. And a couple of reasons for that, just if their sled wasn't handling right, it makes it a lot harder. Because I've been there too, where there might have been a weekend where I was still in great shape and was feeling good. But if the sled was off, man, it drains so much more out of you faster that you could see and know that, all right, if we're in a longer race and it's a physical track, where you don't get a break, say at Wausau, for example, where you're always kind of turning, you don't get that 1 second to catch your breath, that if their sled wasn't handling right, you would know that it's going to physically wear them down just a little bit quicker. And so you'd kind of, you'd get to learn, throughout the heat races in the day and or the year, if somebody had a good handling sled, okay, they're maybe not going to get tired as fast. But if their sled's not handling good, that's an area that maybe you could capitalize on.
Sure. And I remember, like, like you said, like a track like Wausau where you are kind of turning a little bit all the time. I mean, did that, obviously it's not as banked as like what Eagle River is, but just having that factor where you're having that to turn a little bit all the time, did that add that much to, a physical standpoint?
It would, in a different way. And that's where I said, you had to essentially be kind of well-rounded on all aspects of, being in good shape because, Wausau, like you said, you're always turning, you're always leaning. So the nice thing was as though you'd stay kind of hanging off the sled the whole way around. So you're using a little bit more forearm strength, maybe not as much leg muscle or core.
Sure.
Where Eagle River, you're using arm muscle, forearms in the corner. You get to sit up on the straightaway, sit up straight. So then you're, when you're sitting up straight, you're not using your legs or your core as much, and you're, leaning down into the corner. So and that's where you kind of had to be more well-rounded and in knowing what you needed, come race time.